In 1911, a warehouse in Lower Manhattan burned for 11 hours. The fire department later said there was nothing unusual about it. A storage accident, they said. Old chemicals, they said. Nobody died, so nobody investigated. But what was inside that warehouse had been keeping people alive for years. And after the fire, it was gone. Every bottle, every formula, every record of how it was made, gone so completely that most people today have never heard of it. And the man who ordered it destroyed had just finished buying every medical school in America. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on the bell. This channel exists because someone has to say the things that the official record skips over. And this is one of the most skipped over stories in the history of American medicine. Let us go back further than 1911. Let us go back to what the world looked like before the story you were taught begins. There is a model of history that most people absorb without ever questioning it. In this model, medicine before the 20th century was primitive. Doctors bled patients, herbalists guessed. Nobody knew anything. And then, around 1900, real science arrived. Laboratories, pharmaceuticals, controlled trials, progress. This is the story. And like most official stories, it is not entirely wrong. It is just carefully incomplete. Because running alongside the university-trained physicians of the 19th century, there was another system entirely. It moved through different channels, it was documented differently, and in many cases it worked better. The people who practiced it were not guessing. They were working from something older than any American medical institution. They were working from a body of knowledge that came from somewhere else, and from a time that the official record does not like to name. In the Tartarian tradition of understanding, there is a recurring pattern. Advanced knowledge does not emerge. It survives. It comes through in fragments, in family lines, in trade routes, in the hands of people who were trained by people who were trained by people who watched something much older than what we are allowed to call civilization. The practitioners of botanical medicine in 19th century America were not inventors. They were custodians, and what they were custodying was not folk superstition. It was applied chemistry that predated the institutions that later claimed to have invented chemistry. The compound at the center of this story was called Compound 7 by the people who distributed it, though it had other names in other regions. In parts of rural Ohio and Pennsylvania in the 1880s, it was called simply the Tonic. In certain communities along the Mississippi Delta, it was sold as the Bitters. In the Pacific Northwest, among the lumber and mining camps where men worked themselves into metabolic collapse from bad food and brutal hours, it was sometimes called the Governor because people said it governed the blood. The formulation was not identical everywhere. The core active preparation was botanical and mineral in origin, and practitioners adjusted it based on local plant stock, seasonal variation, and the condition of the individual patient. This is not imprecision. This is a level of pharmaceutical sophistication that conventional medicine did not catch up to until personalized medicine became fashionable again in the late 20th century. The people who made Compound 7 were doing personalized biochemistry in the 1870s. What it treated was what we now call diabetes mellitus, though that name was not in wide use at the time. The condition was described variously as the wasting disease, the sweet sickness, or in older European traditions that some of these practitioners still carried, it was called the hippie honey blood. The body could not regulate its own sugar. People grew thin and then thinner. They drank water constantly and were never satisfied. Their wounds would not heal. Their vision failed. They died slowly, and the university physicians had nothing to offer them. Compound 7 changed that. The documented accounts from practitioners who used it between roughly 1873 and 1909 describe something that reads like a different world. Patients who had been wasting for years would stabilize within weeks. The constant thirst would ease. Wounds would begin to close. People would gain weight. Some accounts describe complete remission of all symptoms, maintained as long as the patient continued using the preparation. This is not a few anecdotes. The records that survived, and we will discuss what happened to most of them, number in the thousands. Practitioners from Mississippi to Oregon were reporting the same results across 3 decades. The exact chemistry of why it worked was never formally studied before the formula disappeared. But based on the plant materials that surviving accounts describe, researchers working in ethnobotany and endocrinology in the 1970s and 1980s identified at least 4 compounds that appear in those plant families with known effects on insulin sensitivity, pancreatic function, and glucose regulation. One of the botanical components described in the most detailed surviving practitioner notes belongs to a plant family that modern pharmaceutical researchers have been investigating since 2003 for its ability to mimic insulin action at the cellular receptor level. The old practitioners did not know the word receptor, but they knew what the plant did. Now here is where the story becomes something that the official history has a very specific reason to avoid. In 1901, John D. Rockefeller established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York City. In 1902, he created the General Education Board, and between 1902 and 1910, the General Education Board conducted what it called a survey of medical education in the United States. The man they commissioned to write the report was named Abraham Flexner, and in 1910 he published what became known as the Flexner Report. This document reshaped every medical school in America. Schools that taught botanical medicine, homeopathic medicine, or any system of treatment that did not conform to the German pharmaceutical laboratory model that Rockefeller had invested in were stripped of their accreditation. Many of them closed. The ones that survived did so by abandoning everything that did not fit the new framework. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The Flexner Report is a matter of public record. The General Education Board's funding of it is documented. What is less discussed is what the practical consequence of that report was for practitioners who held knowledge that predated the pharmaceutical model. They lost their licenses, they lost their ability to train students, they lost legal protection for their practice, and in some cases they lost considerably more than that. The men and women who had been compounding and distributing preparations like Compound 7 were operating in 1910 in a legal grey zone that the Flexner reforms were specifically designed to eliminate. When the new licensing frameworks came into force in state after state between 1910 and 1915, continuing to sell or distribute a botanical preparation for a named disease became, in many jurisdictions, a criminal act. The practitioners had to choose stop, move, or go underground. Most stopped, and most of what they knew stopped with them. The warehouse fire in Lower Manhattan in 1911 was not an isolated event. It fits a pattern. In the same period, there are documented cases of formulary records being seized by newly empowered state medical boards in Indiana, in Missouri, in Georgia. The seizures were framed as consumer protection. Unlicensed medicine, dangerous compounds. The records were not analyzed, they were destroyed. The practitioners were fined or jailed. And the patients who had been using the preparations were told by their newly licensed university-trained physicians that the treatments they had been receiving were quackery, and that real medicine would now take care of them. Real medicine, in this context, meant insulin, which was patented in 1921, which required a lifelong dependency on a pharmaceutical product, which created, over the course of the 20th century, a market that by 2023 was generating over $200 billion a year globally. That is not coincidence. That is architecture. The Tartarian framework asks a question that conventional historical analysis tends to avoid, not just who benefited, but who knew. The Rockefeller operation was not reactive. It was not businessmen who stumbled into medicine and happened to crowd out the competition. The scale and precision of what happened between 1901 and 1915 required prior knowledge of what was being replaced. There are researchers who believe that what the Rockefeller organization knew about botanical glucose regulation came from the General Education Board's own survey network. In other words, the survey was not just an audit, it was an inventory. The researchers went in, documented what the practitioners had, understood what actually worked, and removed it from public circulation while the pharmaceutical patents were secured. This is speculative, but it is not unreasonably speculative. The timeline fits precisely. The Flexner survey ran from 1906 to 1909. The report was published in 1910. The Manhattan warehouse burned in 1911. Insulin was isolated and patented in 1921. The gap between the removal of the botanical treatments and the arrival of the pharmaceutical replacement is exactly 10 years, enough time to consolidate the market. What was lost in that 10 years is something we cannot fully measure because the records were destroyed. But we can get partial glimpses. There are practitioner diaries in private collections. There are patient testimonials recorded in local newspapers that have been digitized by historical societies. There are letters. And there are the ethnobotanical follow-up studies from the 1970s and 1980s that, when taken together, begin to reconstruct something of what the original formulations contained. This is the pattern that keeps appearing when you trace the botanical medicine traditions back beyond their American practitioners. The knowledge was not indigenous to 19th century America. It came from somewhere older. It was carried person to person in chains of transmission that the practitioners themselves could not fully trace. There are surviving notes where a practitioner tries to record the source of what he knows and simply writes, received from the old ones, or as was taught before my time. He was not inventing. He was recording something that had already been old for a long time. The Tartarian reading of this is that what was being carried was post-collapse knowledge, residual technical capability from a civilization with a more sophisticated understanding of human biochemistry than the one that replaced it. This knowledge was not held in institutions. It could not be. The institutions were gone. It was held in people, in lineages of practitioners who understood that what they carried was valuable and fragile and needed to be transmitted carefully, because there was no library left to store it in. That fragility is why the suppression worked. When you hold knowledge in people rather than in books, you only have to stop the people. When the licensing boards went after the practitioners, they were not just stopping individuals from practicing, they were severing transmission chains. The knowledge could not jump to a new generation if the generation that held it had been legally and economically destroyed. Most knowledge suppression does not look like a fire. It looks like policy. It looks like a licensing requirement that the old practitioners cannot meet and the new ones were never taught to value. The diabetes tonic story is one node in a much larger pattern. It is one example of what happens when old knowledge meets new money, and the new money has more lawyers. But it is also one of the clearest examples because the timeline is so tight, the actors are so well documented, and the replacement product is so profitable that the incentive structure is impossible to misread. What would be different today if that warehouse had not burned? That is the question worth sitting with. Not just for diabetes, but for every area of medicine where the botanical traditions were shut down in the same decade, by the same apparatus, under the same regulatory cover. The practitioners treating autoimmune conditions, the ones addressing neurological disorders with preparations whose active compounds we are only now beginning to identify in the ethnobotanical literature. All of it ran into the same wall between 1910 and 1920. The suppression was not total. Some practitioners went underground. Some knowledge survived in family lines, in marginalized communities, in the hands of people who never had a license to lose. There are researchers today finding those threads and following them back. The compounds the old practitioners were using are beginning to appear in peer-reviewed chemistry journals not as historical curiosities, but as serious pharmaceutical candidates. And the same industry that spent the first half of the 20th century removing this knowledge from public circulation now holds the patents on the research tools being used to rediscover it. The pathway from ethnobotanical finding to clinical application runs directly through the patent system that the Rockefeller reforms helped construct. The tonic did not just disappear in 1911. The conditions that made it disappear are still operating. They are just operating at a different scale, with better lawyers, and with the added advantage that most people no longer remember that there was ever anything to lose. That warehouse burned for 11 hours. The fire department said there was nothing unusual about it. And maybe they were right, in the sense that for the people who ordered it, this was not unusual at all. It was just Tuesday. It was just one more node cleared from a network they had decided to replace. It was just the cost of doing business in a world where the business was controlling what medicine was allowed to mean. If this is the kind of history that nobody is supposed to talk about, then you already know what to do. Leave a comment, tell someone, and if you have not already, subscribe. Because this channel is not finished asking questions.